Anybody contacting you? Made any comments? All right. We got started this morning about 8:30, working on some issues, trying to make things more efficiently. So I want to tell you, we didn't show up at 9:45. I had y'all come in at 10, and sorry for the 45-minute delay, but we've been working since 8:30, trying to get things done. And I think you'll understand why, but the next witness did a lot of work. And as we go, I may tell them to move on. That's part of what we did this morning is I've heard more, but there's a lot. And that's just, when they call the witness, you'll understand. So thank y'all for y'all's patience. All right, let's see.
Thank you, sir. Defense calls Deborah Gray.
Solemnly swear or affirm the testimony about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. I do. Have a seat, please, ma'am. Once you're seated, state your full name, spelling your last, please.
My name is Deborah Gray, Deborah Grey.
Ms. Gray, would you just tell the jury who you are and a little bit about your background and education?
My name is Deborah Gray. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I have an undergraduate and a graduate degree in communications from Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. From Wake Forest, I went to work at the Department of Social Services, and I worked there not as a social worker to start with. I worked taking food stamp applications and doing intake type things. Then I started in graduate school in social work while I was at the DSS, and I did adult protective services, and I worked in a family counseling unit, and I did that for about 5 years. In the course of that time, I was working primarily with families where children had been abused or neglected, and I worked with parents and families trying to deal with the issues that had been going on and trying to keep families together, or if they couldn't stay together, to help them to come apart in ways that were best for the children. From there, I went to a private psychiatric hospital, and I worked with adolescents there, kids who had been hospitalized because they were having problems living in the community. And so I worked with teenagers and their families, and then ultimately I also worked with adults there who were having psychiatric type problems. I left there after 6 years and went into private practice with a group of psychiatrists, psychologists, and clinical social workers like myself. We diagnosed and treated primarily mood disorders and anxiety disorders, although we did have some thought disorders in the practice, such as schizophrenia. Primarily, we dealt with mood disorders. And my job there was to do psychosocial histories on clients and make recommendations and refer them on to the physicians for medication evaluation. And in the process of doing that, I probably did thousands of psychosocial histories during that time. I also saw patients, 35 to 45 patients in the course of a week, primarily working with people who had mood disorders or anxiety disorders, and oftentimes working with their families. I had an area of specialization in the clinic, working with people who had had some form of trauma in their life when they were younger, or had had substance abuse in their families when they were younger, and it was causing them problems in their adult life. During the time that I was working there, I started working with the licensing board for social work in North Carolina, and I worked as an investigator for them on ethics complaints for about 6 years. And what that meant was that any time someone filed a complaint against a social worker, a licensed social worker in North Carolina, someone would go out and do an investigation to see what was going on, what the findings were, and then testify in hearings related to those complaints. I also started working some with the courts and working specifically with attorneys with clients who had been charged with serious charges frequently capital murder, where I would do in-depth psychosocial histories and oftentimes testify. I've worked with attorneys in the military, in the Army, in the Air Force. I've worked in states all across the country. I've testified in various courts and also in front of the Department of Justice. And that's what I've been doing in addition to my private practice. For about the past 5 years, I left my private practice behind as we moved up to southwestern North Carolina, about 120 miles from here. My husband retired, and I continued to do some work doing psychosocial histories in forensic cases.
Tell us, what is a psychosocial history? How is it done?
A psychosocial history, the long phrase for that is a biopsychosocial history, but that's something that I think that it's too much of a mouthful. So when I say social history, you'll know I mean biopsychosocial history. We look at these different aspects of a person's life. We look at the biological aspects, and that would include their genetic predispositions, their medical history, their neurological deficits, mental illness, mental retardation, IQ, things like substance abuse, exposure to toxins. And then we have to look at all of those issues for every member of their family. And we do that by requesting records, lots and lots of records. The psycho part of the biopsychosocial history has to do with a person's cognitive and emotional and social competencies, how they internally navigate the world. It's their coping skills, their problem-solving skills, their defense mechanisms, their social skills, their personality structure, and their developmental functioning. Are they functioning like a 26-year-old, or are they functioning like an 8-year-old? We look at those sorts of things. And finally, the social part of a biopsychosocial history has to do with their interactions with the world, including the quality of that maternal bond when they were little, the risk factors in early and mid-childhood, family patterns of abandonment and abuse that may have affected this person in the present, physical, emotional, sexual abuse or neglect, family stability, economic, emotional, and residential, school adjustment, and neighborhood demographics. We're also looking to see what kind of relationships has this person had in the course of their life. Have they been significant relationships? Have they had people that they felt close to? So that's the social side.
And what fields rely on social histories like this?
I've been in the social services world, and I've been in the psychiatric world, and both of those fields rely on social histories. When I first started doing social histories, it was to work with the district attorney's office and the police department in presenting adult protective services issues, and then it was to present child protective services issues in the courts. More recently, it's been working with psychiatrists hand in hand, sometimes doing the treatment while they provide the medications. A lot of communication there, and they rely on the social history. In the forensic setting, oftentimes the forensic psychiatrist and the psychologist will rely on an in-depth social history. They're concerned about what happened at the time of the crime. I'm concerned about everything that led up to that. And this information that I've gathered gives them a sense of this person's life history leading up to the day that the crime happened.
And did you conduct a social history in this case?
Yes, I did.
And that was your role, that's your role in this case?
Yes, it is.
Some defense would offer Ms. Gray as an expert in licensed clinical social work.
We're done. All right. She is so qualified.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Gray, you did a little bit of this, but tell the jury in a little bit more detail, more specific to this case, the type of sources that you use in creating your social history.
I look at gathering information to put together a history as wanting to have the most stability that I can in my data. So I think about it as being a three-legged stool. And one of those legs is whatever the individual who's been charged is telling me. Another leg is what the family tells me, what the community tells me, what people who knew this person tells me. And I try to see whether there are correlations or confirmations between those two things. And the third leg is documents. I look to see if there are documents out there that might confirm something that I've been told, might even give more detail about something that I've been told. So I'm constantly checking things that I hear in the here and now with things that I hear from other people, as well as things that I read in documents that I've gotten.
Mr. Gray, you've reviewed the defense, what's been marked for identification purposes, defense exhibits 353 through 60. Are these records that you reviewed in this case, or electronically?
I did review them electronically. I did not have to have paper copies of these.
That's good. And these records, you looked at these notebooks to know that these records are all, every record in here is double-sided, right?
Yes, they are.
And these records pertain to people in Tim's family, to Tim?
For every person that's got a genetic relationship to Tim, I've tried to find whatever records that I can that would relate to their medical condition, their school history, their mental health conditions, their legal history, their substance abuse history. So whenever a person is identified as being genetically related on either side, I'm asking for and looking for records about that person, as well as records about Tim.
Your Honor, subject to the previous objection, we'd offer defense 353 through 360 for evidence.
Subparts may be extracted.
Yes, sir. Mr. Dawson,
We discussed that pre-trial.
yes, sir. Mr. Dawson, you can open my objection, please.
Noted?
Thank you. Now, the social history, what's one of the sort of instruments you use to represent the social history in a single page or a single image?
One of the tools that social workers use is something that's called a genogram. And a genogram is sort of a fancy word for a family tree. And lots of people, probably on the jury, even have family trees. This is a family tree. And it's a family tree for Mr. Jones, for Tim, that goes back 2 or 3 generations. I put that together for 2 reasons. One is, as I'm coming to know the different people in the family, it helps me to keep those relationships straight because it gets very confusing. But as I find out more information about each of these people, over time I'm adding things to that family tree that show the types of problems or difficulties that person might have had in the family. I'm looking for patterns.
Your Honor, may I approach?
May.
Mr. Gray, I just want to ask you if you recognize, for identification purposes, defense 362 and 363.
Yes, I do.
Okay, and are these accurate representations of the two versions of the genogram for Tim?
Yes, they are.
Your Honor, I would offer Defense Exhibit 362 and 363 into evidence and ask permission to publish 362 at this time. For
Let me see. No, I saw them earlier, but
Yes, sir.
there's two versions. I'm not sure. Fine, 362 been admitted subject to state's objection.
No, Your Honor,
Okay,
I have no
okay.
clue.
Withdrawn.
Ms. Gray, I'm going to show you 362. And you see at the top, obviously, it says Tim Jones. And is this the genogram that you created sort of initially about Tim and his family?
Yes, it is.
Okay. I'm going to zoom in the hopes that we can see it a little bit better. But will you tell the jury what some of the, or how a person looks at these and what the key means?
Is there any way I could have a laser printer so that I could show them what I'm,
Right there.
is that,
I think you push that little button in the middle. You should point.
okay,
Yes.
thank you. Okay. There is a key here, and in the key it tells you that a circle represents a female, a square represents a male, and the line between them represents a marriage. If someone has an X through their square or circle, it means that they're deceased. So as you look up here in this family, you have great-grandmother, and then you have, that's Tim's great-grandmother, and then you have the man who is his great-grandfather, and he is also his grandfather. You have his grandmother, Roberta, you have his father, Tim Sr., and then you have Tim right here, Amber, and then the children. Over here is his mother, Cynthia.
Ms. Secor,
Yes, sir.
I got one of the jurors indicating to me you may be standing their way.
I'm sorry.
That's right. And so just be aware, maybe
Yes,
stand over here closer in front of Joy.
Yes, sir.
Sorry. Whichever. They
Thank you.
now y'all realize if you want to turn, if it's easier to see the monitor there with the details up there, y'all go either way. Okay. All right.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so you just got to sort of outline some of the main characters. And the other exhibit that we'll talk to the jury about at the end, how does that differ? Is that colored by the social history?
Yes, at the conclusion of talking about the social history, there will be a genogram that shows everything that I found in the course of doing this investigation.
I guess probably the best thing to do is to leave this up here for reference for now. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, please.
Okay. I think that's about as good as I can do on the Zoom. So, I guess we can sort of start now to tell the jury this social history, this story of this family's life. Is that unless I've forgotten to mention something that we need to talk about? Okay. Well, let's start with Roberta. And the jury's heard some things about Roberta's life, but from your perspective, a clinical social worker and in the realm of social history, what did your social history reveal that was important to you about Roberta and her young life?
I'll say a word about why the social history is important to a clinical social worker and why we're going to start with his grandmother and grandfather. And that is, when people go to the doctor asks you what your family history is for medical illnesses like heart disease or diabetes or seizure disorders. And they do that because these are things that have a degree of heritability to them. The tendency or the predisposition can be inherited, and they want to know what that is in your background. And they want to know that in part because then they want to look at you and say, what are the risk factors that you have that could contribute to you developing these conditions? For example, If they find out you have heart disease, they may want to look at your weight. They may want to look at your diet. They may want to look at exercise. They may want to look at your stress level. All of those are documented risk factors for developing heart disease in somebody who has that predisposition. I'm looking for other predispositions, and I'm looking for patterns. When someone goes to see a clinical social worker, we say, tell us not just about your parents, but tell us about your grandparents and what you know about how they were raised. And in particular, in this family, it's important because grandmother Roberta actually at some point became the default mother for Tim. So she's not just his grandmother, she's also in some ways the person who took over his care around 3 years old.
And if you have the risk factors that you look for, do you also try to look for whether or not people had, I think we can call resilient factors?
I do.
Okay. And tell us what the resilient factors mean for your purposes.
Resilient factors are those things that will buffer or protect somebody from developing a condition. For example, let's go back to the heart disease issue. Your protective factors in that would be you keep your weight down, you don't smoke cigarettes, you exercise regularly, you manage your stress. Those are all protective factors. In families, the protective factors would be, for example, a loving and caring relationship with a primary caregiver. It could be that you have adequate food and shelter and clothing. It could be that there was a teacher somewhere along the line that took a special interest in you and encouraged you along the way, even though you were having difficult times in your family. Those are examples of some protective factors.
Okay. So when you look at Roberta's young life, what's important to you for the purposes of the social history?
We're looking at Roberta here, Tim's grandmother. Roberta's mother had 5 children, and Roberta was the youngest. She was in a series of difficult relationships and relinquished those 5 children, one of whom went to live with one set of relatives, another went to live with a different set of relatives, and Roberta and the other 2 went to live in an orphanage. Roberta was about 3 years old when that happened. This is significant as a social worker because what Roberta reports is that she always felt that she was abandoned, that she was not wanted. Coming out of that, there came a time when Roberta was going home for Christmas with her father. Father brought them back.
I just want to say, when going home for Christmas, do you mean from the orphanage?
From the orphanage. He picked her up at the orphanage and was taking her home for Christmas. And when he brought her back, the orphanage was closed. So he left her and her little sister, or her big sister, on the orphanage steps with a note pinned to their chest. They were about 5 or 6 years old at the time. Subsequently, Roberta's mom married a man named Ted Montaigne.
And that would be up there at the top of the kids' room?
That's right. That's right. Roberta said in a form that she completed, I believe, for the state's evaluation, something called a mental health questionnaire, that Ted Montaigne used to throw boiling water on her mother, that he threw her mother down the stairs, that he beat Roberta too.
This is some of the details I want.
Okay.
Keep moving.
Okay. And that he began having sex with her when she was 8 years old.
And that's Roberta.
That's Roberta.
And when she came home from the orphanage, or her mother brought her home from the orphanage around age
Correct.
8. Okay. And so the home that she comes back to is her mother, Bernadine, and the new stepfather, Ted Montaigne.
That's right.
And he's the person that starts having sex with her.
He started having sex with her and with her sisters.
Okay. How does his abuse of Roberta, does it continue, or is it a one-time incident?
It did continue. It continued with enough frequency that at age 11, he impregnated her. She got pregnant at age 11.
And Roberta got pregnant at age 11 with what child?
Ted Montaigne's child, her stepfather's child.
And that child was to be?
Tim Jones Sr.
That would be Tim's dad.
Tim's dad was born when his mom was 12 years old. That's correct.
What, was that the only child that Ted Montaigne has through the sexual abuse of Roberta?
No. Roberta was taken out of school in the 5th grade, and Ted Montaigne subsequently took her from her home. She had a second child by him at age 14. She had a third child by him at age 16. And at age 16, he forced her to marry him. There's a wedding certificate that shows Roberta as being 22 and Ted Montaigne being 39. Well, Ted Montaigne was 39, but Roberta was only 16, according to her own birth certificate.
And is Roberta's mother, Bernadine, is she around anymore, or has Ted taken them away from her?
Ted had taken them away from her mother, and she reports that nobody came to look for her. Her mother didn't come to look for her, reinforcing that idea of being an unwanted child.
And what is life like? Just a couple of examples. What is life like for Roberta and Tim Sr.? Tim Sr. is an infant, I guess, at this point.
Tim Sr. was an infant to about age 5 while they were all living together. And Tim Sr. saw certain things, like Ted Montaigne beating and choking his mother with some frequency. The relationship between Roberta and Ted Montaigne was a very violent one. He frequently would beat her, sometimes to the point of unconsciousness.
Yes, sir. And the other things that he forced her into for purposes of him making money included what?
He put Roberta into prostitution while she was still a young teenager. She was only 17 when she managed to finally get away from him. And so it was before the age of 17, probably around 15 or 16.
And these are things that are happening before Tim Sr. reaches the age of 5.
That's right.
And the reason that the things involving Ted Montaigne stop when Tim Sr. is 5 is because they get away from him. Is that right?
They did manage to get away from him.
Once they got away from him, does he still play a role in their lives even though they're not living with him?
He did. Roberta, as she phrases it, was rescued by her knight in shining armor, her husband still today, Larry, who was also only 17. So we have 2 17-year-olds with 3 small children, 2 still in diapers, who then start running across the country trying to get away from Ted Montaigne because she's afraid that he will find her, hurt her, or take her back into his custody. So they're on the move for a good part of Tim Sr.'s childhood.
And just as an example, from your social history, what does it tell you about the number of schools that Tim Sr. went to as a child?
Tim Sr. describes going to 8 or 9 schools before they finally settled down when he was in late middle school. So he was on the move at least once a year, if not more than once a year, to various cities in various states.
And will you just point out to us where Larry Thornsberry is, the person that Roberta married when she got away from Ted?
I'm
Should have pointed number.
trying.
Try this one. May I approach?
Yeah.
Wait, there we go. This is Larry Sr. right over here as step-grandfather. And Larry Sr. became, to Tim Sr., his dad. So if you hear him talking about his dad, that's who he's referring to. He's not referring to Ted Montaigne, who is his biological father and his step-grandfather.
Now, the jury's heard some testimony about Larry Thornsberry, Roberta's current husband, and some of the issues that they had in their family. But from the perspective of social work, just describe some of the things that happened in their relationship, what their home was like, and why, from the perspective of social work, that is reflective of what had happened to Roberta before.
Part of what Tim Sr. says is that Roberta started drinking, and she started drinking a lot as a way to deal with what she had been through. But he also reports that when she would get triggered, she would go into these rages, these rampages. Is it okay if I use certain language here? There is a lot of profanity in this family, and the children were exposed to it.
A little bit. The jury's heard some salty language.
Okay.
I presume that's what you're talking about.
I am.
And if it's convenient to use abbreviations if necessary, I believe everybody will probably know what you mean.
Okay. What Tim Sr. said was her drinking was always bad, and it got worse as she got older. She would take it out on Larry. She would F the house up. She was in Mount Prospect. My mom believes in ghost shit. She thought the house was haunted. Mom pulled a gun out and pointed it at everyone. It had a hair trigger, and she said she was going to kill all you MFers. She claimed it was the spirits in her, and then she busted up the whole house again, but they never arrested her. Police came and they let her go home. He said our normal life was just constant shit. You never knew what was going to happen next. I was always alert, always watching to see what would happen. My dad did the best that he could.
And when Senior was talking about his dad, then he was talking about
Larry.
And Larry also had some difficult things in his past that I think you raised in your social history. We could just
I did.
touch on a couple of those.
Roberta married a man who came from trauma not unlike her own. At the time she married him, Larry's father, Buck, was in prison for killing 2 men. His father had also had sex with his daughters. Larry's father had beaten his mother, and one of Larry's sisters had accidentally killed his other sister while playing with a loaded shotgun. So he came from a lot of difficulties in his life, too.
And Larry and Roberta are married for a few years and then are divorced. Is that right?
Correct.
And tell us who Roberta marries at that.
Roberta then married a man named Philip Caliendo, who had a lot of money and had some alleged ties to the mob. And so the family went from being fairly poor to having a lot of resources. But the relationship between Roberta and Philip was also one that had a lot of fighting and a lot of arguing in it.
And the descriptions that you got from Senior about the drinking and the trashing the house and the threat with weapons and obscenities, does your social history show that continues, that behavior of Roberta's continues while she's married to Philip Caliendo?
Tim Sr. said that when they were living in Oak Grove, all hell broke loose. Mom would go on these rampages.
And you're saying, I think I can describe something.
Yeah, I think, keep moving.
Okay. Just tell the jury in your own words, what types of things that Senior found when he would come home during that period of time?
He would find, and this is while she was married to husband number 3, Philip Caliendo, that the house had been trashed, that she had been on some sort of rampage. And on one occasion when he came home, he heard that his stepfather, Philip, was in the hospital where he had had a heart attack.
So that marriage lasts a very short period of time.
It was short.
And why does it end?
I'm not sure exactly why it ended. Roberta ended up back with Larry.
Right.
And I think, the sense that I got was that despite the financial advantages that she had to being with Mr. Caliendo, her heart pulled her back to Larry Thornsberry.
And at this point in social history, what year are we in approximately?
It's about 1977, and that's the point when Miss Thornsberry came back together with Larry, and little Larry was born, the only child of Larry Thornsberry and Roberta Thornsberry. The other children are by Ted Montaigne.
Okay. And Tim Senior is about how old? He's a teenager at this
He
point?
was about 12 when his little brother was born.
And the violence and the threats and the substance abuse that you described about Roberta and Larry's first marriage, does that again appear in their second marriage?
Yes, it does. It continues.
And Tim Sr. lives with this as sort of somewhat his normal life.
That's right. That is his normal.
Okay. And this goes on for another several years, is that right?
It goes on well into the birth of Tim Jr., and then intermittently from then on, yes.
Now, you have, part of what you've done is interviewed people yourself in this case.
I have.
And what have you noticed about this family? Obviously, a lot of things that you're talking about are upsetting, troubling things, but did you find that is there a strong sense of love and commitment in this family as well?
There is a strong sense of love and commitment, and I'm impressed by that every time that I'm around them. They have been through a lot, but there is a lot of love and a lot of caring there between these folks.
Tim Sr., he leaves school at about age, I think, 16.
Around 16.
And can you just tell us what your social history told you about why that happened?
The records did not start to be available on Tim Sr. until he got into junior high, and they showed him as having some difficulties. He was being followed by a school social worker for unknown reasons, and they noted that he had times of just staring off into space. Then when he got into the 9th grade, he had 50 absences, which is about 10 weeks of absences. They passed him nonetheless, and the next year, 10th grade, he had 40 absences within that first semester and then just stopped going to school for lack of interest, is what they said.
And is that, based on his life experience at that point, was that surprising to you that he was starting to drop off?
Keep moving.
Okay. We'll go to Tim Sr. and Cynthia Granada, who the jury has heard about a little bit. They are Tim's biological parents, right?
Correct.
And when did they meet approximately?
They came together when they were both about 16 years old. I think both of them had come out of school by then, and they met at a bar somewhere on the outskirts of Chicago.
And so that's 1980 when they come together and meet. And I just want to go back briefly and have you tell the jury what your social history told you about what had happened to Cynthia in her life from the time she was born to 1980 when she meets Senior. Sort of use the genogram to help us see that.
Trying. There we go. So this is the mother, Cynthia, here. And up here is her father, Domingo, and her mother, Maggie. And as you can see, Cynthia is one of 9 children. The information that I've received through her psychiatric records, which give some history, is that she was sexually molested for the first time at age 3 by a stranger, and then intermittently molested over the years by other men, including her father. Her father fathered a child with her oldest sister up here. Her father had a lifelong history of alcohol problems with regularly getting intoxicated and becoming violent in the home. He also was into a form of voodoo called Santeria, and what she reported at some point that was that he would put her in a closet in the dark with a dead chicken bleeding down on top of her as some sort of ritual that he kept skulls in the room, that he had jars with human fetuses and fingers. To a little girl, anyway, that's what those looked like. So she came from her own set of difficulties.
And her father, Domingo Bernardo, he was not always in the home. He was back and forth to Texas. Is that right?
One of her psychiatric records later said that it seemed to the psychiatrist he only came back to town long enough to impregnate the mother, and then he would leave again. And his substance abuse-related charges are largely from Texas, showing that he spent a fair amount of time there.
We'll go back later on and talk about what else in Cynthia's records were particularly relevant to you. But how is it that, Cynthia ends up living in the Jones or the Thornsbury home, I guess. Is that right?
Yeah, there came a time when Cynthia started staying at the Thornsbury house, and Roberta thought that was kind of strange. So she called Cynthia's mother and said, "Your daughter's over here." And the mother said, "That's fine. She can stay." And she did.
And she was how old at this point?
She was 16.
As was Senior.
More or less, yeah. They're about 10 months apart.
And is this around the time when they get pregnant with Tim?
Yes, they got pregnant sometime around March of 1981.
And does your social history tell you about how Cynthia was at that point in terms of whether people saw things about her that were odd?
Roberta had seen a few things that struck her as strange, like she would never eat with the family. She would never be in the same room alone with Larry. She would give things to the girls, to Tim's little sister, and then steal them back again. Just things that struck her as kind of strange.
And do those behaviors do they increase once she gets pregnant with little Tim?
They did increase somewhat. Roberta found her one time in the closet, huddled and crying and saying her father was coming to get her. She found her standing and staring at herself in front of the mirror, and she couldn't seem to tear herself away.
Oh, just a minute. And once Tim Jr. is born to Cynthia and to Senior, how does she react to this new baby?
Within a couple of days of coming home from the hospital, she told Roberta that she wished that baby would just shut the F up. What family members noticed was that she seemed kind of hollow and empty when she was around the baby. She didn't seem to be very interested in the baby. There were times that she would put the baby in a locked room, leave the baby there screaming and crying, and wouldn't go take care of the baby Tim, and wouldn't let Roberta go take care, or Tim take care of the baby either. She refused to change his diapers at times and refused to let Roberta do that, despite the fact that he was crying. There were times that she refused to feed the baby because she said she didn't want a fat baby. There were times that she gave little Tim laxatives because she said she wanted to cleanse his soul. There were times that she would put the baby in a bathtub of icy water and then leave the baby there because she wanted him to learn to listen. And then there were other times that she would put the baby in winter clothing in the middle of a hot Chicago summer, saying that she didn't want the baby's skin to see light. So her behaviors over time became increasingly abusive and increasingly neglectful towards the baby.
And you're saying your baby, we're talking
The baby is Tim, yes.
You've created some demonstratives with sort of condensed versions of the information from different periods of time that I'd like to use, but I think I should probably approach the solicitor if I may. Thank you.
Show me some things drew in my direction this time. It's 8 volumes. Trying to condense it a little more efficiently. They prepared these demonstrative evidence exhibits, highlighting a lot of the information in there. They're going to be shown to you on the overhead. They're not going to get you some evidence, so you won't have any evidence. It's to help streamline the testimony. That's all.
And Ms. Gray, these demonstratives that you made, I think that they represent the different homes that Timmy lived in and the things that are relevant to you from the perspective of social work about those homes. Is that right?
It represents what the people who raised him brought to that raising as a result of what they had been through in their lives. How were they prepared to parent this infant when he came home from the hospital?
And the first one, I think this is the first one. Yeah, this is the first one. That's a picture of the actual home that Tim Jr. came home to, right?
Yes.
And where in that house were Tim Sr. and Cynthia and Tim Jr. living?
They were living in the basement of that house, and Roberta and Larry and the other children, the ones that were still at home, were living in the upstairs of that house.
And some of the things that you touched on, some of the things that are already up there, but any others that we should discuss right now for purposes of this time frame?
Yes, this was one of those incidences where someone had told me a story, and I actually found a couple of police reports that gave an even more complete story than what I had been told. And the story was that when Tim was about 7 months old, and in the house, this house, his dad and mom got into an altercation that started off with some pushing, and then his dad choked his mom for several seconds. When she broke loose, she went to run downstairs, which she did, and came downstairs, and the pushing and shoving continued, and then he punched her in the side of her face. She said at that point she wanted to take the baby and leave, and they wouldn't let her take the baby, so she left and went to her mother's house. The police reports show that 2 days later, she came back to the house with her sister, demanding to get little Tim, and was refused. In the house at that point were Tim Sr., Roberta, and I believe one of Tim Sr.'s daughters, one of Roberta's other daughters. Cynthia, Tim's mother, got into an altercation with Roberta, and the daughter tried to intervene and stop her from slapping and punching her mother. At the same time, Timmy's aunt went downstairs and climbed into the house through a basement window, grabbed baby Timmy, and then climbed out another window and took off running, at which point the police arrived and started chasing them and apprehended her. So Timmy's mom was charged with battery on the second account. His dad was charged with battery on the first account, and her sister was charged with criminal trespassing on that second account. So in the first 7 months of his life, there's documented exposure of some of this physical violence that's been described.
And this incident, when the police came, this was after Cynthia started exhibiting all these bizarre behaviors and her neglect and abuse.
It was just starting.
Okay.
She was still in the family for another couple of years after that, in and out.
Okay. Now, there are periods of time when Senior and Cynthia are still married that she disappears with Tim Jr. for periods of time. Tell us what you know about that.
There were times when Cynthia would take off and she'd be gone for days and they wouldn't know where she was. It was a real concern to little Tim's grandmother, who told her son that she thought that Cynthia was friggin' nuts and that she shouldn't be allowed to be alone with the baby. And yet she would disappear for several days on end with the baby. I actually had the opportunity to meet with Cynthia several months ago, and she told me that during this period of time she was prostituting and that her husband was aware of that. And she also told me that she was
Keep moving.
dancing at a strip club.
Getting too detailed. Okay. All right.
All right. Tim Senior and Cynthia, I think you already said that they stay together despite the problems that they're having, right?
That's right.
And do they get pregnant again with another child?
They did.
And tell us what your social history and interviews with various people, or how does that informed you?
They were living back in the home with Roberta at that point. They were sort of in and out during these 2.5 years that they were together. And Cynthia was fairly far along in her pregnancy. She was in the bathroom taking a bath and called out. When Roberta went into the bathroom, there was...
Not too much detail. That's really...
She was taken to the hospital and she lost the baby.
Okay. And what does your social history say about what people in the family that witnessed that, Roberta and Tim Sr., what did they think?
They believed that she had self-aborted.
I wanted to kind of minimize that. That's keep moving. Lost the baby. Please keep moving.
All right. We're about what year approximately, Ms. Gray?
Tim's parents were together until he was about 2.5 years old.
Okay. And how does the issue of custody get resolved between Tim Sr. and Cynthia over Tim Jr.?
There came a time when Cynthia and little Tim just disappeared. Tim Sr. went home and the apartment that they were sharing was empty and nothing was in there but a cake in the middle of the floor. He didn't hear anything from Cynthia until several weeks later when she called from Florida asking if he would post her bail. Didn't know where Timmy was. Ultimately found Tim Jr. at the maternal grandmother's house, and that's the point at which he did a custody petition, an emergency custody petition to take temporary custody.
And ultimately, did he get custody?
He did.
He did. And Tim was about how old at that point?
Tim was close to 3 years old at that point.
And what role, if any, does Cynthia have in Tim Jr.'s life from the age of 3 forward?
Cynthia was not physically present in Tim's life for his entire childhood. He didn't see her again until he was in his 20s. She remained a constant issue for him in terms of how he thought about her from that time on.
When he's 3 years old and Cynthia leaves, who becomes his sort of default mother?
Roberta does.
And is he living with Roberta still and Larry and Senior at this point?
I think over the next several years, there's an independence and back to dependence with Roberta and her family. Tim's memory is that mostly he stayed with Roberta, although there were times that Tim Sr. had housing of his own. Tim may have been there some on the weekends. It's also Tim's memory that his dad worked out of town a lot. So he remembers Roberta as his mom and called her mom.
Yes, ma'am. From around the ages of 4 and 5, when Cynthia's gone, what are the reports, police reports, tell you about things that are going on in that home where he's growing up? Just a couple of examples, if you can.
When he was 4 years old, there's a police report that shows Roberta of being suspected of shooting at Larry through the kitchen window. There is a police report from when he is 5 years old where both Roberta and Larry were arrested and convicted for possession of cannabis and cocaine. And Tim Sr. recalls that the police came to the house to arrest them.
And do your interviews and things that you've reviewed show you that there's still the sort of the violence and the obscenities and the threats going on with inside that family?
Yes, I talked to several family members who, on the one hand, emphasize how much love there is in this family, and on the other hand, emphasize how crazy it was at times. There were a lot of descriptions of activities that some of which were identical and some of which were similar enough that they may have happened at a somewhat different time that went on in the family.
And is it appropriate to move on to the next demonstrative that we have about Roberta's house?
Yes.
Specifically?
Hey, let's take a break right
Yes,
there.
sir.
It's a good place to just stop for a few minutes, because I was thinking, Drew, that's correct, in this case, like I ain't